I let my ex-business partner think he'd outsmarted me while I quietly bought all his suppliers. The day my business partner walked into our shared office with that smug grin plastered across his face, I knew something was seriously wrong. We'd been running our small manufacturing operation together for 3 years, and I'd never seen him look quite so pleased with himself. The way he avoided eye contact while shuffling papers around his desk made my stomach drop. I'd trusted this guy with everything: my savings, my reputation, even my family's financial security. When he finally turned to face me, his expression had shifted to something resembling concern, but I could see right through it. He started explaining how the market was changing, how our costs were getting out of control, and how maybe it was time for one of us to step back. The whole speech felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it in his bathroom mirror for weeks. My hands started shaking as I realized what was happening. He was pushing me out of my own company. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, but how calculated it all seemed. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. All those late nights he claimed to be working on client proposals, all those private phone calls he'd step outside to take, all those sudden business trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. I'd been so focused on keeping our operations running smoothly that I'd completely missed the signs of him building his exit strategy. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at a stack of legal documents he'd presented me with. The buyout offer was insulting, barely enough to cover my initial investment, let alone compensate me for 3 years of sweat equity. My wife kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain how thoroughly I'd been played. The shame was overwhelming, knowing that I'd trusted someone who'd been planning to screw me over from the beginning. Sleep became impossible over the next few weeks. I'd lie awake replaying every conversation, every decision, every moment where I should have seen this coming. The legal fees alone were going to drain what little savings we had left. My wife started picking up extra shifts at her job, and I could see the stress wearing on her face. Our kids kept asking why Daddy seemed so sad all the time, and I had no idea how to explain that their father had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he'd considered a friend. The legal battle dragged on for months. My former partner had clearly done his homework, surrounding himself with expensive lawyers who seemed to anticipate every move I made. Every document I requested took weeks to produce. Every meeting got rescheduled multiple times. Every small victory was immediately countered by some new procedural obstacle. It felt like fighting a war with a water gun while he had artillery. What really stung was watching him continue to operate the business like nothing had happened. He'd hired new people to replace me, restructured the entire operation, and was already talking about expansion plans. Meanwhile, I was bleeding money on legal fees and getting nowhere. The few mutual friends we'd had in the industry started avoiding me, probably assuming I was the problem since he was the one still standing. 6 months into this nightmare, something unexpected happened. One of our old suppliers called me out of the blue, asking if I knew why my former partner had been so difficult to work with lately. Apparently, he'd been trying to renegotiate all their contracts, demanding better terms and threatening to take his business elsewhere. The supplier seemed frustrated and mentioned that several others were having similar issues with him. This conversation planted a seed of an idea that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight him in court, maybe I could approach this problem from a completely different angle. If he was alienating suppliers with his aggressive tactics, perhaps there was an opportunity there. I started making discreet inquiries with other vendors we'd worked with, just casual conversations to see how things were going. The picture that emerged was fascinating. My former partner had become increasingly demanding and difficult since taking over the business. He'd apparently convinced himself that he was now in a position of strength and could dictate terms to everyone. Several suppliers mentioned that they'd started looking for alternative customers because working with him had become such a headache. I began reaching out to these suppliers, not as someone trying to compete with my former partner, but as someone who might be interested in forming new business relationships. I was careful not to mention my history with him or my intentions. Instead, I focused on building genuine relationships and understanding their needs. Many of them remembered working with me fondly and were eager to explore new opportunities. The first major break came when one of our former raw material suppliers offered to sell me their entire operation. They were a family business, and the owners were ready to retire but didn't want to sell to a large corporation. They knew my work ethic and trusted me to maintain their relationships with existing customers. The price was steep, but I managed to secure financing by putting up everything I owned as collateral. Suddenly, I wasn't just another potential customer, I was now a supplier myself. And my former partner had no idea what was happening. He continued to treat me like a defeated enemy, while I quietly built a network of relationships that would soon control much of his supply chain. The irony was delicious, but I kept my emotions in check and focused on the long-term strategy. The second acquisition came just 3 months later. Another supplier, this one specializing in packaging materials, was struggling with cash flow issues. They needed an investor, and I was in a position to help. By structuring the deal carefully, I managed to gain controlling interest while allowing the original owners to maintain day-to-day operations. Again, my former partner remained completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. The beauty of this approach was that it was entirely legitimate and above board. I wasn't trying to sabotage his business or engage in any questionable practices. I was simply building my own network of suppliers and partners. If he happened to depend on those same suppliers, well, that was just an unfortunate coincidence from his perspective. By the end of the year, I controlled or had significant influence over nearly 60% of his critical supply chain. I'd managed to acquire 2 companies outright and had established exclusive partnerships with several others. The whole time, he continued to negotiate aggressively with these suppliers, apparently unaware that many of his toughest negotiating partners were ultimately working for me. The third major acquisition was the most satisfying. His primary logistics partner, the company that handled all his shipping and distribution, was looking to expand into new markets. They needed capital and expertise, and I was able to provide both. Within 6 months, I'd become their largest investor and had a seat on their board of directors. Now I was in a position to see detailed reports about his business operations. Not because I was spying or doing anything unethical, but because I was a legitimate stakeholder in companies that served his business. I could see his order volumes, his shipping patterns, his inventory levels, and his payment histories. The picture that emerged was of a company that was struggling more than he wanted to admit. His aggressive negotiating tactics had backfired spectacularly. Several suppliers had already started prioritizing other customers over him, meaning his orders were frequently delayed or given lower priority. His costs were increasing because he'd burned bridges with vendors who used to give him favorable terms. Most importantly, he seemed to have no idea that his entire supply chain was slowly shifting away from him. The final piece of the puzzle came when his biggest customer, a major retailer, reached out to me directly. They'd heard about my growing network of suppliers and were interested in potentially working with me instead of him. Apparently, they'd been having quality control issues with his products and were looking for alternatives. They offered me a contract that was nearly twice the size of anything I'd handled in my previous business. This was the moment I'd been working toward for over a year. I had the suppliers, the logistics network, and now the customers needed to launch a competing operation. But instead of rushing into it, I took time to carefully plan my next move. I wanted to make sure that, when I finally revealed my hand, the impact would be devastating and permanent. I started by gradually increasing my orders from the suppliers I now controlled. Nothing dramatic, just steady growth that looked like normal business expansion. At the same time, I began offering these suppliers better terms and more reliable payment schedules than they were getting from my former partner. The message was clear: I was a better customer than he was, and they should prioritize my needs accordingly. The first sign that he was starting to feel the pressure came when one of his regular suppliers called to inform him that they were having trouble meeting his delivery schedule. They claimed it was due to increased demand from other customers, but I knew the real reason: my orders were taking priority. His response was predictably aggressive, threatening to find alternative suppliers and demanding compensation for the delays. This played right into my hands. His threats gave the suppliers additional justification for deprioritizing his orders, and his demands for compensation strained relationships even further. Meanwhile, I continued to be the understanding, reasonable customer who worked with suppliers to find mutually beneficial solutions. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Over the next few months, his supply chain problems multiplied. Deliveries were consistently late, quality control issues increased, and his costs kept rising as suppliers found creative ways to charge him premium rates. He responded by becoming even more demanding and difficult, which only made the situation worse. It was like watching someone dig their own grave while handing them a bigger shovel. The logistics problems were particularly brutal. His shipping partner, now under my influence, started experiencing mysterious capacity issues whenever he needed to move large orders. Suddenly, trucks weren't available when he needed them, warehouse space was limited, and his packages were getting lower priority in the distribution network. His delivery times to customers started slipping, and complaints began pouring in. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my own operation. I'd rented a small facility and hired a core team of experienced workers. Unlike my former partner, I focused on creating a positive work environment where people felt valued and respected. Word spread quickly in our industry, and several talented individuals who'd grown tired of his management style reached out about potential opportunities. The most satisfying moment came when his head of operations, someone I'd worked with for years, called to ask if I might be interested in hiring him. He'd grown frustrated with the constant supply chain problems and the increasingly toxic work environment. He knew the business inside and out, and his departure would leave a massive hole in my former partner's operation. I hired him immediately, along with 2 other key employees who decided to follow him. Suddenly, my former partner had lost not just his most experienced staff, but also the institutional knowledge they possessed. He was forced to hire replacements quickly, and the new people struggled to understand the complex web of supplier relationships and customer requirements. The domino effect was spectacular to watch. As his experienced staff left, quality control suffered even more. As quality control suffered, customer complaints increased. As customer complaints increased, he lost major contracts. As he lost major contracts, his cash flow tightened. As his cash flow tightened, he became even more aggressive with suppliers, creating a vicious cycle that fed on itself. His financial situation became critical when his biggest customer terminated their contract due to repeated delivery failures and quality issues. This contract had represented nearly 40% of his revenue, and losing it created an immediate cash crisis. He was forced to lay off workers, which only made his operational problems worse. The business was collapsing from within, and he seemed powerless to stop it. The final blow came when his bank called in a loan that had been secured by his business assets. The combination of declining revenue, increasing costs, and operational chaos had made him too risky to continue financing. He had 30 days to find alternative funding or face bankruptcy. I learned about this through my network of suppliers, who'd started demanding cash on delivery from him because of concerns about his financial stability. At this point, I could have simply waited for him to fail completely. His business was clearly doomed, and I was well positioned to capture his remaining customers and market share. But I wanted something more than just victory. I wanted him to understand exactly what had happened and who was responsible for his downfall. I arranged a meeting with him, ostensibly to discuss the possibility of acquiring some of his assets before they went to auction. He was desperate enough to agree, probably hoping that I might throw him a lifeline. When I walked into his office, I could see the stress and exhaustion on his face. The confident, smug expression from 2 years earlier had been replaced by something much more vulnerable. I let him give his sales pitch about the value of his remaining assets and the potential for turnaround. He was clearly trying to present the situation as a temporary setback rather than the complete collapse it actually was. When he finished, I calmly explained that I wasn't interested in buying his assets because I already controlled most of the value in his business. The look of confusion on his face was priceless as I walked him through exactly what had happened. I explained how I'd systematically acquired his suppliers, gained influence over his logistics network, and recruited his best employees. I showed him documentation, proving that companies he'd been negotiating with for months were actually working for me. The realization dawned slowly, and I watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. He asked why I'd gone to such elaborate lengths instead of just competing with him directly. I explained that direct competition would have been risky and expensive, with no guarantee of success. By controlling his supply chain, I'd been able to watch him destroy himself while building my own operation with minimal risk. It was elegant, efficient, and absolutely devastating. The bankruptcy filing came 3 weeks later. His remaining assets were liquidated at auction, and I was able to acquire his customer list, equipment, and intellectual property for a fraction of their original value. His former customers were already working with me, his best employees were on my payroll, and his suppliers were now my suppliers. I'd managed to take everything he'd stolen from me and much more. The most satisfying part wasn't the financial victory, though that was certainly sweet. It was the knowledge that I'd outplayed someone who'd considered himself so much smarter than me. He'd thought he was the chess master, moving pieces around the board while I scrambled to respond. In reality, I'd been playing a completely different game, one where I controlled the entire board while he focused on individual pieces. My new business launched officially 6 months later, built on the foundation of relationships and assets I'd carefully assembled. The revenue in our first year exceeded what our original partnership had ever achieved. More importantly, I'd learned valuable lessons about trust, planning, and the importance of building genuine relationships rather than simply trying to extract maximum value from every interaction. The experience changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed: strategic thinking, patience, and the ability to execute complex plans over extended periods. I'd also learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate gratification, but the slow, methodical dismantling of someone who's wronged you. The whole process had taken nearly 2 years, but the results were far more comprehensive than anything I could have achieved through conventional means. Looking back, I realized that his betrayal, as painful as it was at the time, actually did me a favor. It forced me to think differently about business and relationships. Instead of simply reacting to his actions, I'd been forced to develop a long-term strategy and execute it with precision. The skills I'd developed during this process had made me a much better leader and strategist than I'd ever been before. The final irony was that he'd probably done better financially by staying in partnership with me than he would have by trying to cut me out. His greed and arrogance had ultimately cost him everything, while my patience and strategic thinking had delivered rewards beyond what I'd originally imagined. Sometimes the best way to win a game is to change the rules entirely, and that's exactly what I'd managed to do.